I call Jan Logie, 5-minute call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to take a call on this, the taxation annual rates for 2015 to 16, Research and Development and Remedial Matters Bill, which substantially deals with child support. Though you certainly wouldn't know it from the title. The Green Party is supporting this bill, and for many of the reasons that's been outlined by my colleague Julianne Genter in her previous contribution. So I would like to restrict my contribution to talking about child support and possibly, if I have time and don't talk too much, a couple of other points. So I think it's important to realise that when we're looking at the number of changes in this bill to the child support system, that this Parliament only 2 years ago considered legislation for the amendment of child support, and that piece of legislation went to the Social Services Committee, and there was a very, very thorough consideration of child support issues. And yet here we are, about 2 years later, with quite significant amendments before we've actually even had the opportunity to see those changes truly bed in. And it does need to be restated that legislation, while it was being considered, the opposition did raise concerns about the ability of IRD to be able to deliver a very complex formula and the system that might be required to implement that, and that as a result of that legislation passing, we've seen the overrun for implementation of that new formula being estimated to costing $180 million. That's the overrun for that project of around $180 million. And we are seeing significant amendments coming back to this House less than 2 years later. So, to some of the substance of those amendments that are being put in front of us, they are extending the requirement for the Commissioner of Inland Revenue to write off certain penalties. And they also are providing for an opt-out option for parents if they both agree to treat payments as a private matter rather than a liability through the Inland Revenue Department. Now, I'd like to speak about each of those points separately. And I noticed that the submissions to the Select Committee, and while I didn't sit on it, there were no submissions from the social sector of people who may be dealing with families on a social level, experiencing breakup and going through needing to use this child support system. There was a useful contribution, I thought, from Borsha Consulting, who has quite a few clients who are using that system, and noted that the outstanding debts around child support were $3.2 billion as of December 2014, which is a phenomenal amount of money. And I do think that we would have benefited from this committee, rather than it going to Finance and Expenditure, to have again been considered by Social Services in the context of 1996 research, a safety survey that showed 70% of separated women had experienced some form of domestic violence. So if the assumption is that the lack of payment is purely just that people are struggling to get the administrative things in place, I would tell this House that's not the experience of most organisations and most women who are struggling to get their child support payment. We know that child support is used as a weapon in violent relationships, and that factor needs to be considered when we're making changes to the legislation. And I have not seen any evidence that that has been properly considered in this piece of legislation, and that is a real shame, because it should be. I totally understand that the penalties may have been disproportionate and weren't working as an incentive and I would love to see that recognition applied in other areas from this government. And it is unfair. I do believe that those penalties accrue to the Inland Revenue Department and not the family and the children themselves to get the benefit of those that extra money. So in summary, because I'm being told to wind up, there's a lot to say about this bill, and I don't think all of these different policy points should be in one piece of legislation, but we are on balance supporting this legislation.